The Woman in Room 607 by Victor Halloway. I took the job at the Mayfair Hotel in downtown Los Angeles in 1964 because it was quiet, and quiet was exactly what I needed. The city was loud, but the Mayfair was different, a forgotten corner of 7th Street with a crumbling Art Deco facade. The guests were drifters, traveling salesmen, and the occasional couple too cheap or desperate to stay anywhere better. Nobody asked questions at the Mayfair, and that suited me just fine. I wasn't proud of my past. A few bad decisions, a few wrong people, and suddenly I was Raymond Cole, ex-con and night clerk, at a hotel where the wallpaper peeled like dead skin. The Mayfair didn't care who I was or what I'd done, as long as I showed up on time and didn't steal from the till. One night, she checked in. It was late, just after midnight, and the lobby was empty except for me and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. She didn't look like the usual crowd we got at the Mayfair. She was young, mid-20s maybe, with dark hair that fell in loose waves around her face. Her dress was simple but elegant, pale blue with a high neckline that made her look like she'd stepped out of a black and white movie. "Do you have a room?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. I handed her a key to room 607 and watched as she disappeared into the elevator without another word. Something about her unsettled me, not in a bad way exactly, but enough to make me light another cigarette as soon as she was gone. The rest of the night passed uneventfully until just after 3 a.m. when the phone rang at the front desk. It startled me out of my half-sleeping haze, and I fumbled to answer it on the second ring. "This is Cole," I said automatically. There was silence on the other end for a moment, before a woman's voice whispered, "It's cold." "Hello?" I said, sitting up straighter in my chair. "Who is this?" But there was no response, just static crackling faintly before the line went dead. I hung up and rubbed my eyes, chalking it up to some drunk guest playing games, or maybe just my own exhaustion getting to me. Still, something about that voice lingered in my mind for the rest of my shift, soft and distant, like it had traveled a long way just to reach me. The next morning, everything changed. I stayed late after my shift ended because one of the housekeepers had found something in room 607. Nothing sinister at first glance, just an empty room with neatly made sheets. But when they checked the bathroom, they noticed water pooling on the floor beneath the sink. That's when they called maintenance. By noon, half the staff was gathered on the roof by one of our water tanks, a massive steel cylinder that hadn't been serviced in years, but somehow still worked well enough to keep guests from complaining about low pressure. When they opened it up, well, that's when things got strange. Inside was a body, a woman floating face up in murky water with her dark hair fanned out like seaweed around her head, and not just any woman, her, the guest from room 607. The police were called immediately, of course. Questions were asked, statements were taken, but none of it made sense. How had she gotten up there? Why hadn't anyone seen or heard anything? And most importantly, why did no one remember seeing her leave her room? That night, after most of the commotion had died down and I was back at my post behind the desk, I decided to review the security footage from last night. Not because I thought it would help, the cameras barely worked half the time, but because curiosity wouldn't let me rest until I did. At first glance, everything seemed normal. There she was walking into room 607 around midnight. There she was again leaving her room around 2:30 a.m., heading toward... Wait. I rewound it 3 times just to be sure. She wasn't heading toward anything. She wasn't even walking properly anymore. Instead, moving jerkily down hallways where no cameras should have been able to see her clearly given their angles. Yet somehow every frame showed her staring directly into the lens moments before disappearing entirely again. What broke me, though, came later in the footage. Hours after, the police confirmed the body retrieval. The same figure stood in the lobby unmoving, staring at the front desk where I'd sat clueless on an earlier shift. The hotel didn't just house secrets, it chose them, fed off whispered regrets and sins of past lives trapped forever, repeating a cycle that devoured those unlucky enough to cross its threshold. unprepared to deal with the truth buried beneath the peeling wallpaper and deadened fluorescent hums above its decaying grandeur. And now the Mayfair waits for its next victim, knowing full well that someday soon it might very well be me. The Midnight Visitors by Eleanor Vance. I moved to Boulder in the spring of 1988, hoping to leave behind the wreckage of my marriage and start fresh with my son Danny. The town seemed perfect: quiet streets, friendly neighbors, and the Rockies looming like sentinels in the distance. It wasn't long before I rented a modest 2-bedroom house on Maplewood Drive, its peeling white paint and creaky porch steps somehow comforting in their imperfections. I thought this place would be a refuge, a chance to rebuild. I was wrong. Danny was 8 at the time, still adjusting to the idea that his father wouldn't be coming back. He spent most afternoons playing in the backyard or drawing pictures at the kitchen table while I worked part-time at a nearby diner. His drawings were always cheerful: bright suns, stick figures holding hands, and the occasional spaceship. But one day, about a month after we moved in, his artwork changed. He began sketching shadowy figures with hollow eyes, standing under trees or peering through windows. At first, I thought it was just his way of processing the divorce. Kids have strange ways of expressing themselves. But then he started talking about them. "They're watching us," he said one evening as I tucked him into bed. His voice was matter-of-fact, as though he were describing something as ordinary as the weather. "Who's watching us?" I asked, brushing his dark curls away from his forehead. "The kids," he replied. "They stand outside and stare." I glanced toward the window, but saw nothing except the swaying branches of the elm tree in our yard. "It's just your imagination," I assured him, though his words left me uneasy. The first time I saw them was 2 nights later. It was late, past midnight, and I had been sitting at the kitchen table nursing a cup of tea and flipping through an old photo album. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards, a sound I had grown accustomed to over the weeks. Then came a knock at the front door. It wasn't loud, just 3 soft raps, but it startled me nonetheless. Who would be visiting at this hour? My first thought was that it might be one of my neighbors needing help, so I rose from my chair and approached the door cautiously. When I opened it, they were standing there, 2 children, no older than 10. A boy and a girl dressed in old-fashioned clothes that looked out of place even for Boulder's eclectic style, a button-down shirt and suspenders for him, a faded dress with lace trim for her. Their skin was pale, almost grayish under the porch light, but it was their eyes that stopped me cold. They were black, not dark brown or hazel, but pitch-black pools that seemed to swallow all light. "Can we come in?" the boy asked, in a flat voice that sent shivers down my spine. I froze, gripping the edge of the door tightly. "It's late," I said finally. "You should go home." "We don't have a home," the girl whispered. Her words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. My instinct screamed at me to shut the door, but I couldn't move, not until they spoke again. "We'll come back when you're asleep," they said in unison. That broke whatever spell had held me captive. Without another word, I slammed the door shut and locked it. My hands trembled as I backed away from the entryway, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might wake Danny upstairs. For what felt like hours, I stood there staring at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. But nothing happened, not that night anyway. The next morning, I told myself it had been some kind of prank, local kids trying to scare me. But deep down, I knew better. Their voices had been too cold, too unnatural for any child. Over the next few days, things began to unravel further. Danny refused to play outside anymore and started sleeping with his bedroom light on, a habit he hadn't had since he was 5 years old. He claimed he could hear them whispering outside his window at night, "Let us in." I tried to dismiss his fears as nightmares or overactive imagination until one evening when I found muddy footprints on our porch steps, small ones that could only belong to children. They led up to our front door but stopped abruptly, as if whoever made them had vanished into thin air. Terrified but determined not to let fear consume me, I called Sheriff Harris, a gruff man in his 50s who always seemed skeptical of anything out of the ordinary, and explained what had been happening. He listened patiently but offered little reassurance beyond promising to send a patrol car by our house every now and then. "It's probably just some kids messing around," he said before hanging up. But they weren't just kids, not in any sense of the word. The final incident happened on a moonless night in early June. Danny had fallen asleep on the couch while watching cartoons, so I carried him upstairs and tucked him into bed before heading back down to lock up for the night. As I reached for the deadbolt on the front door, there came another knock, soft but insistent. I didn't answer this time. Instead, I peeked through the peephole with trembling hands. They were there again, the same boy and girl, but now their faces were closer than ever before, pressed against the glass like they were trying to peer inside. "Let us in," they whispered. I didn't sleep that night, or any night after that for weeks, and eventually packed up our belongings and left Boulder altogether without telling anyone why. Even now, years later, as I sit here writing this from an apartment far away from Colorado's shadowy forests and quiet streets, I can still hear their voices sometimes. Faint whispers carried by wind or woven into silence. "We'll come back when you're asleep." The Girl in the Prom Dress by Everett Harlan. I've always hated driving Route 66 at night. Something about the endless stretch of asphalt cutting through the Arizona desert feels wrong, like the road itself is alive and waiting for you to make a mistake. It's not just the isolation, though that's bad enough. It's the way the darkness seems thicker out there, pressing against your headlights like it's trying to smother them. But when you're a long-haul trucker, you don't get to pick your routes. And on that particular night in October 1972, I had no choice but to push through. The load was light, just a shipment of auto parts bound for Flagstaff, and my rig handled the empty road with ease. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my gut. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the memories of Vietnam that always crept up when I was alone too long. Either way, I kept my hands tight on the wheel and my eyes fixed straight ahead, ignoring the occasional tumbleweed that skittered across my path. It was just past midnight when I saw her. She appeared suddenly in my headlights, a teenage girl standing on the shoulder of the road, her thumb outstretched in that universal gesture of desperation. She was wearing a pale pink prom dress, torn at the hem and smudged with dirt, and her hair hung in tangled waves around her face. For a moment, I thought she might be some kind of mirage, a trick of my tired mind, but as I slowed down and pulled over, she didn't disappear. I rolled down the passenger side window and leaned out. "You okay?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. She nodded but didn't say anything right away. Her eyes were wide and glassy, like she'd been crying for hours. "Can you give me a ride?" she asked softly. I hesitated. Picking up hitchhikers wasn't something I normally did, especially not after everything I'd seen overseas, but leaving her out there alone felt wrong. She couldn't have been more than 16 or 17. "Where you headed?" I asked. "Flagstaff," she replied. I nodded toward the passenger door. "Hop in." She climbed into the cab without another word, clutching a small purse against her chest like it was all she had left in the world. As soon as she settled into the seat, I eased back onto the road, keeping one eye on her and one on the horizon. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the rumble of the engine and the occasional crackle of static from my CB radio. Finally, I broke the silence. "What happened to your dress?" I asked. She glanced down at herself as if noticing it for the first time. "There was an accident," she said vaguely. "Car accident?" I pressed. She shook her head, but didn't elaborate. Her answers were clipped and evasive, but there was something about her voice that kept me from pushing too hard. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like resignation, like she'd already given up on being understood. As we drove on, she started to relax, or at least seemed less tense, and even cracked a faint smile when I told her about some of my trucking mishaps over the years. Blown tires in the middle of nowhere. Run-ins with shady mechanics who overcharge for repairs. She didn't laugh outright, but there was something warm in her expression that made me feel like I'd done something right by picking her up. But then she said something that made my skin crawl. "You shouldn't have stopped for me," she murmured. "What do you mean?" I asked cautiously. Her gaze drifted out the window toward the empty desert beyond. "It's dangerous to stop on this road." I frowned, but didn't reply right away. There was something strange about her tone, like she wasn't warning me about herself, but about something else entirely. Before I could ask what she meant, she turned back to me with an unreadable expression and said, "Thanks for giving me a ride." And then she vanished. I mean vanished. One second she was sitting there beside me, the next she was gone. No puff of smoke, no flash of light, just gone like she'd never been there at all. The seatbelt hung loose where she'd been buckled in, swaying slightly as if disturbed by an invisible breeze. I slammed on the brakes so hard my rig skidded sideways across both lanes of Route 66 before coming to a stop. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the empty seat beside me, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined her? Was this some kind of waking dream brought on by exhaustion? But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Her purse was still there. I stared at it for what felt like hours before finally reaching over and picking it up. Inside were a few crumpled dollar bills, a tube of lipstick, and an old Polaroid photo tucked into one corner. The picture showed a younger version of her standing beside an older couple, her parents maybe, with Route 66 stretching out behind them like an ominous backdrop. When I finally reached Flagstaff later that morning, still shaken from what had happened, I stopped at a diner near my drop-off point and asked around about missing persons in the area. One waitress, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes, mentioned a girl who disappeared 10 years earlier while hitchhiking along Route 66 after prom night. Her name was Emily Harper. The name sent chills down my spine because it matched what had been scribbled on a note tucked into her purse. Emily Harper. I never drove Route 66 again after that night, not because I was afraid, but because some roads aren't meant to be traveled twice. The Phone Booth at the Edge of Nowhere by J.D. Kessler. The desert doesn't care if you live or die. I learned that the hard way in '76 when my Chevy broke down 20 miles east of Baker. The engine gave one last shudder, then silence. Just the sound of my own breath and the sun beating down like a hammer on an anvil. No water, no shade. Just sand and the distant shimmer of heat rising off the asphalt. That's when I saw it. A phone booth. Standing alone in the middle of nothing, its glass panels fogged with dust, the metal frame warped from years of relentless sun. It looked like it had been there forever, waiting. I didn't question it. Desperation makes fools of us all. The receiver was ice cold in my hand. No dial tone, just a hollow silence, like holding a seashell to your ear and hearing the void instead of the ocean. I was about to slam it back down when... Ring. I nearly dropped the damn thing. No phone lines for miles, no power, but it rang, clear as church bells on Sunday. I answered. Static first, then a voice, low, garbled, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. 34, 2000, 412, minus 116.4219. Coordinates. The line went dead. I should have walked away. But I didn't. The numbers gnawed at me all afternoon as I sat in the meager shade of the booth, waiting for a car that never came. By sundown, I was digging through my pack for the old road atlas I kept folded in the bottom. The coordinates led to a spot 5 miles north, middle of nowhere. I told myself it was nothing, a prank, a wrong number. But the desert doesn't do coincidences. I hiked out at dawn. The heat was already brutal, my canteen nearly empty by the time I reached the spot, a shallow depression in the earth, half hidden by scrub brush. And the smell. Sweet, rotting. I didn't want to look, but I did. The grave was fresh, just deep enough to hide what was inside. Fingers, curled like pale spiders, breaking through the loose soil. I didn't scream, didn't run, just stood there, my stomach churning as the reality settled over me. Someone had been here, recently, and they'd left me a message. The phone rang again that night. I dragged myself back to the booth. My skin burned raw, my throat too dry to even cough. When the ringing started, I didn't hesitate. "Next one's closer," the voice whispered. "Same as before, wet, distorted. 32.7684, minus 115.5632. I slammed the receiver down, but I wrote the numbers in the dust on the glass, just in case. 3 days passed. No cars, no people, just the phone ringing every night, each set of coordinates leading to another patch of disturbed earth. I stopped digging after the second one. The faces were always the same, bloated, sun-bleached, their mouths open in silent screams. I didn't know them, but they knew me. Because on the fourth night, when the phone rang, the voice wasn't a stranger's. It was mine. "Vince," it said, and my blood turned to ice. "Run." I dropped the receiver. It swung on its cord, knocking against the glass like a pendulum. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the empty expanse, and beneath it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. They found the booth eventually. Empty, of course. The receiver was still off the hook, swaying gently in the breeze. And if you listened close, pressed your ear to the static, you could just make it out. A voice, whispering numbers, waiting for the next traveler to answer. Whispers in the Dust, by Caroline Hale. I arrived in Silver Vein, Nevada, on a cold October morning in 1980. The town was a ghostly remnant of a once thriving mining community, abandoned after the veins of silver and mercury ran dry. I was there to study groundwater contamination, a task that seemed straightforward but would soon unravel into something far more sinister. As I stepped out of my truck, the silence enveloped me like a shroud. It wasn't just the absence of people or cars. It was as if the land itself had stopped breathing. The air was heavy with a metallic scent, like old pennies left to corrode in water. I began collecting water samples from the old well at the town center, the equipment sinking into the murky depths with a soft splash. The first sample was cloudy, streaked with red-brown sediment that smelled faintly of rot. Mercury levels were high, as expected, but there was something else in the water, tiny flecks that moved almost imperceptibly, like they were alive. As I explored the town, I noticed something strange. The buildings were empty, but I could hear whispers coming from inside them. At first, I thought it was just my imagination or the wind playing tricks on me, but the voices grew louder, calling out names I didn't recognize and laughing softly when I turned corners. I tried to focus on my work, but the whispers haunted me. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time, echoing off the walls and fading into the silence. I began to feel like I was being watched, like unseen eyes were following me as I moved through the deserted streets. The samples I collected showed not just mercury, but those strange moving organisms. They clustered together under magnification, forming shapes that seemed almost deliberate. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were trying to communicate something, but I had no idea what. By the time I left Silver Vein, I was shaken. The whispers followed me even after I drove away, lingering in my mind like a shadow. Back in Reno, my report was dismissed, but I knew what I had seen and heard. Silver Vein was a place where the past lingered, where the earth itself seemed to whisper secrets to those who dared to listen. Even now, months later, I still hear those whispers sometimes, faint echoes carried by the wind or woven into silence. They remind me that some places aren't meant to be revisited, that there are truths buried beneath the poisoned earth that are better left unspoken. Silver Vein remains a haunting reminder of the secrets that lie in the forgotten corners of our world, waiting for the next unwary soul to cross its threshold. The Car That Wasn't There, by Daniel R. Grayson. The stretch of Nevada highway between Alamo and Rachel is a place that feels like it exists outside of time. It's flat and endless, bordered by scrubby desert and distant mountains that shimmer in the heat. Locals call it the extraterrestrial highway, thanks to its proximity to Area 51, and all the stories about UFOs and strange lights in the sky. Jen and I weren't there for aliens, though. We were just two people on a road trip, trying to escape the grind of our lives in Los Angeles. It was June of 1986, and the sun was setting as we drove westward in my beat-up Chevy Nova. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, and the road stretched ahead like a ribbon disappearing into infinity. Jen had her feet propped up on the dashboard, flipping through a stack of Polaroids we'd taken earlier in the trip, pictures of roadside diners, quirky gas stations, and us grinning like fools in front of kitschy tourist traps. "This place is eerie," she said, glancing out the window at the barren landscape. "It feels like we're the only people left on Earth." I laughed. "That's kind of the point, isn't it? No traffic, no noise, just us and the open road." But then I saw it. Headlights in the rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was just another car, a black sedan, maybe a local or another traveler heading toward Rachel. But as the miles ticked by, I noticed something strange. The car stayed exactly the same distance behind us, never speeding up or falling back. "Hey," I said, nudging Jen's arm, "take a look behind us." She twisted in her seat to peer out the back window. "What about it?" "It's been following us for a while now," I said. "Doesn't that seem odd?" Jen shrugged. "Maybe they're going to Rachel too." I nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The desert stretched on endlessly around us. No towns, no turnoffs, and yet this car seemed content to trail us at a steady pace, its headlights glowing like twin eyes in the gathering darkness. By the time we reached Rachel's lone motel, a squat building with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign, the car had vanished. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, swallowed by the night without so much as a sound. Jen dismissed it as nothing, a coincidence, or maybe just my imagination, but I couldn't let it go. Something about that car had felt wrong, like it wasn't just following us but watching us. We checked into our room, a small space with mismatched furniture and curtains that smelled faintly of mildew, and tried to settle in for the night. Jen fell asleep quickly, her breathing soft and steady as she curled up under the thin motel blanket. But I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying those headlights in the mirror, their eerie constancy. Around midnight, I got up to grab a drink from the vending machine outside. The parking lot was empty except for my Nova sitting under a flickering streetlight. But as I turned to head back inside, I saw something glinting on my windshield. It was a Polaroid photo. I snatched it up and stared at it under the weak light of the street lamp. My stomach dropped when I saw what it showed. Jen and me asleep in our motel room, the exact room I'd just left, with shadows pooling around our faces like ink stains. I ran back inside and locked the door behind me, shaking Jen awake with trembling hands. "What's wrong?" she mumbled groggily. I held up the photo without saying anything. Her face paled as she stared at it, her eyes darting toward the window like she expected someone to be standing there watching us. How did they get this?" she whispered. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The next morning, we left Rachel as fast as we could pack our bags. Jen insisted we stop at a diner for breakfast. She needed coffee to calm her nerves, but even there I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. When we got back on the road, everything seemed fine at first, just miles of empty highway stretching ahead. But then, I saw them again, those headlights in my rearview mirror. "Not again," I muttered under my breath. Jen turned to look, but froze when she saw what I did. Not just one car, but several black sedans trailing us now, like predators stalking prey. "Speed up," she said urgently. I floored it, pushing my Nova faster than I'd ever dared before. But no matter how fast we went or how many turns we took, those cars stayed with us until suddenly they were gone again. When we finally reached Las Vegas later that night, exhausted and shaken, I found another Polaroid tucked into my glove compartment. This one showed me staring into the rearview mirror, with shadowy figures looming behind me. Jen refused to talk about the trip afterward, claiming it was all just a bad dream, But deep down, we both knew the truth was undeniable. Some roads aren't meant to be traveled twice, especially those winding through Nevada's desolation, haunted by whispers and lingering headlights that seem to fade into echoes of forgotten fears. The memory of those phantom cars still haunts me, a reminder of the secrets that lie in the forgotten corners of our world, waiting for the next unwary traveler to cross their path. The Night Watch by Gregory L. Finch. I took the job at Halston's department store in downtown Portland because I needed something steady. It was 1974, and the economy wasn't exactly kind to guys like me, ex-military, no college degree, just a few years of bouncing between odd jobs. The pay wasn't great, but being a night security guard had its perks. Quiet hours, no customers to deal with, and plenty of time to think. Halston's was one of those sprawling, multi-level department stores that catered to the city's middle class. By day, it was bustling with families shopping for clothes and cookware, but by night, it was eerily still. The mannequins were the worst part. Hundreds of them scattered across the store, frozen in poses meant to look casual, but instead felt unnatural. Their blank faces stared out into the darkness, and no matter how many times I walked past them, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me. The first time I noticed something strange was about a month into the job. It was just past midnight, and I was making my rounds on the second floor when I saw it, a mannequin standing in the middle of an aisle where it hadn't been before. I stopped and stared at it for a moment, trying to remember if I'd seen it there earlier. It was dressed in a men's suit, its plastic hands gripping an empty briefcase. Something about its posture seemed off, too stiff even for a mannequin, but I chalked it up to my imagination and moved on. The next night, it happened again. This time, the mannequin was standing near the escalators with its head tilted slightly to one side. I knew for a fact it hadn't been there when my shift started. I'd checked that area myself during my first round. I reported it to my supervisor the next morning, but he just laughed and told me I was probably tired or bored. "Mannequins don't move," he said with a smirk. "You're letting your mind play tricks on you." Maybe he was right, or maybe he wasn't. A week later, things escalated. I was patrolling the women's clothing section when I noticed one of the mannequins had something unusual about its face. At first glance, it looked like any other dummy, smooth plastic skin, painted lips, but as I got closer, I realized its mouth wasn't made of plastic at all. It had real teeth. They were yellowed and uneven, jutting out from its gums like they'd been ripped from someone's mouth and shoved into place. My stomach churned as I stared at them, trying to convince myself they weren't what they seemed, but no amount of rationalizing could explain away what I saw. I backed away slowly and finished my rounds without looking at another mannequin for the rest of the night. The turning point came 2 nights later. I'd just finished checking the basement storage area when I heard something upstairs, a faint scraping sound like metal dragging against tile. My pulse quickened as I climbed the stairs toward the noise, flashlight in hand. The sound led me to the third-floor furniture section, a dimly lit space filled with couches and dining sets, arranged like someone's ideal living room. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but then I saw it, a mannequin standing in front of a display table with its arms raised as if reaching for something. Its skin wasn't plastic anymore. It was human. I froze as my flashlight illuminated the grotesque sight. Pale flesh stretched tightly over its frame, stitched together in places where seams didn't belong. Its face was blank, except for a pair of hollow eye sockets that seemed to stare straight through me. And then I recognized the skin. It belonged to Marty, the janitor who worked nights with me. He hadn't shown up for his shift earlier that evening, but none of us thought much about it. Marty had been talking about quitting for weeks now. But here he was, or what was left of him, turned into some horrific mockery of life. I stumbled backward and ran down the stairs without looking back. The police didn't believe me when I called them later that night. They searched the store but found nothing unusual. No human-skinned mannequins or real teeth embedded in plastic mouths. Just rows of dummies standing silently in their displays. My supervisor fired me the next day for causing trouble. He said Halston's didn't need paranoid employees scaring off customers with wild stories about haunted mannequins or missing janitors. But even now, months after leaving that job, I still see them sometimes. Mannequins with two human features staring out from store windows as I walk down Portland streets late at night. And every time, their mouths seem just slightly too wide, their teeth just slightly too real. The Phantom Train by Franklin J. Harper. I've worked on the railroads near Tehachapi Loop for most of my life. It's a place that gets under your skin, with its endless curves and steep grades snaking through the California hills. The loop itself is an engineering marvel, a spiraling stretch of track where trains cross over themselves like some giant metal serpent. But it's also a place with a history, a dark one. Accidents, derailments, and stories whispered among the workers about things that don't belong on the rails. I never paid much attention to those stories. I'm not the superstitious type, or at least I wasn't, until the night I saw the train. It was 1971, late October, and I was working the graveyard shift at the yard near Monolith Station, just a few miles from Tehachapi Loop. The night was clear but cold, the kind of cold that settles deep into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. Most of my coworkers had clocked out hours ago, leaving me alone to finish some paperwork in the tiny office next to the tracks. At 3 a.m. sharp, I heard it, the distant rumble of a locomotive. I frowned and glanced at the schedule pinned to the wall. No trains were due through this stretch until morning. Maybe it was a mistake, an unscheduled freight or a maintenance run, but as I stepped outside to check, I realized something was wrong. The sound wasn't coming from the main line. It was coming from the old spur track that hadn't been used in decades. The rails there were rusted and overgrown with weeds, barely visible in the moonlight. And yet, as I stood there staring into the darkness, a train appeared. It came around the bend slowly, almost cautiously, its headlights cutting through the fog that had suddenly rolled in. At first glance, it looked like any other locomotive, a black steam engine pulling several passenger cars, but as it drew closer, I realized it wasn't modern at all. The engine was old-fashioned, straight out of the 1920s, with ornate brass fittings and a smokestack belching thick black smoke. I froze as it passed by me, close enough that I could see every detail: chipped paint on its hull, cracked windows in its cars, and passengers inside, dozens of them. But they weren't alive. Their faces were skeletal, their hollow eye sockets staring out at me as they waved with bony hands. Some wore tattered suits and dresses, others were draped in shrouds or uniforms that looked like they belonged to another era entirely. Their mouths moved as if they were speaking or laughing, but no sound came from them, just the low groan of the train's wheels grinding against rusty rails. And then it vanished. One moment it was there. The next it was gone. No screeching brakes or fading light, just an empty stretch of track where seconds earlier a train had been barreling through. I stood there for what felt like hours before finally stumbling back into the office and locking the door behind me. My hands shook as I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. A ghost train? It sounded ridiculous even as I thought it, but what else could it have been? The next morning, I told myself it had been a hallucination, a trick of exhaustion, or maybe even some leftover fumes from an old diesel engine drifting through the air. But when I got home later that day and pulled back my sheets to climb into bed, my heart stopped. Coal dust covered my mattress. It wasn't much, just a thin layer scattered across the sheets, but it was unmistakable, black and gritty with that faint metallic smell you only get from real coal. My stomach churned as I stared at it, trying to convince myself it had been there all along, that maybe I'd tracked it in from work without realizing, but deep down I knew better. Something had followed me home. Over the next few nights, things got worse. Every time I closed my eyes, I dreamed of the train, its skeletal passengers waving at me as it thundered past, and woke up drenched in sweat with coal dust staining my hands and clothes. Once, I even heard its whistle echoing faintly outside my window at exactly 3 a.m. I started asking around at work about phantom trains near Tehachapi Loop, not directly, I didn't want anyone thinking I'd lost my mind, but casually enough to get some answers. Most people laughed off my questions or shrugged them off entirely, except for one old-timer named Gus. He leaned in close when I brought up strange sightings on old tracks and said quietly, "You saw her." "Her?" I asked. "The death train," he said grimly. "Happens every few years near Tehachapi Loop, always around Halloween. They say she's cursed, wrecked back in 23 during a storm when she tried to climb too fast up the grade near Monolith Station." "What happened?" I pressed. "Derailment," Gus replied. "Killed everyone on board, passengers and crew alike, and left nothing but wreckage scattered across those hills." I swallowed hard but didn't say anything more after that. Not because I didn't want answers, but because deep down I already knew them. It's been 50 years since that night near Tehachapi Loop, and though I've long since left railroad work behind, I still hear her whistle sometimes when October rolls around. Faint echoes carried by wind or woven into silence just before dawn. And every time, coal dust appears somewhere unexpected, reminding me that some ghosts never truly fade away, no matter how far you run. The Hunger in the Pines by Margaret Holloway. I arrived at the cabin near Donner Pass just before dusk, the last rays of sunlight filtering through the pines like golden threads. It was smaller than I'd expected, just a single room with a sagging roof and walls that seemed to lean inward, as though the forest were trying to reclaim it. The air smelled sharp and earthy, tinged with the faint metallic scent of snow melting in the shadows. I parked my car on the gravel drive and stepped out, my boots crunching against the frost-crusted ground. The cabin had been rented for me by the Chronicle, the paper I worked for in Sacramento. My editor thought it would make a good base for investigating the recent string of disappearances in the area, hikers, hunters, even a park ranger, all vanishing without a trace. It was my first big assignment since transferring from the lifestyle section, and I was determined to prove myself. But as I stood there staring at the cabin, unease prickled at the back of my neck. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the woods. Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional. A battered table and chair, a narrow cot pushed against one wall, and a wood-burning stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The only decoration was a faded photograph nailed above the stove, a black and white image of a family standing stiffly in front of the same cabin, their expressions grim and hollow-eyed. I shivered and turned away. By nightfall, I had settled in as best I could. The stove crackled with warmth, and my typewriter sat ready on the table beside a stack of notes about Donner Pass's grim history. The ill-fated party stranded here during the winter of 1846 to 47, forced into cannibalism to survive. It wasn't hard to imagine their desperation. Even now, with modern roads and conveniences, this place felt isolated enough to swallow you whole. I was halfway through typing my first draft when I heard it, scratching at the walls. It was faint at first, just a soft rasping sound, but it grew louder as I sat frozen in my chair. My pulse quickened as I stared at the far wall, where the sound seemed to be coming from. "Rats," I muttered under my breath, trying to convince myself. But deep down I knew better. Rats don't whisper. The voices began shortly after midnight. They were faint at first, just murmurs carried by the wind, but they grew louder as the hours dragged on. At times they sounded like pleading, at others like laughter twisted into something cruel. I pressed my hands over my ears and tried to block them out, but no matter how tightly I squeezed my eyes shut, they seeped into my thoughts like water through cracks in stone. When morning finally came, I stumbled outside into the pale light of dawn, desperate for fresh air. The forest was eerily silent, no bird song or rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness that made my skin crawl. As I stood there trying to shake off the lingering dread from the night before, I noticed something strange, bite marks on my arm. They weren't deep, just shallow indentations, but they were unmistakably human. My stomach churned as I stared at them, trying to remember how they had gotten there. Had I done it myself in some fevered dream? Or had someone or something done it while I slept? I spent most of that day pacing around the cabin and rereading my notes about Donner Pass's history. The whispers didn't return during daylight hours, but their absence felt ominous rather than comforting, as though they were waiting for nightfall to come back stronger than before. By evening, exhaustion had overtaken me enough that I managed to doze off on the cot despite my fear. But when I woke up hours later, it wasn't because of whispers or scratching, it was because of hunger. It hit me suddenly and violently, a gnawing emptiness that felt like it was eating me from the inside out. My stomach growled loudly as I stumbled toward the stove and rummaged through my supplies for something to eat. Crackers, canned beans, anything to fill the void. But no matter how much I ate, it wasn't enough. The hunger only grew stronger. And then came the whispers again. This time they were louder than ever before, so loud they drowned out even my own thoughts, and their words were clearer now. "Join us." I staggered toward the door in a blind panic, desperate to escape their grasp. But when I flung it open and stepped outside into the moonlit forest, what greeted me wasn't freedom, it was horror. Figures moved among the trees, pale and emaciated with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. And though their faces were gaunt and unrecognizable, there was something familiar about them, something that made bile rise in my throat. I slammed the door shut and pushed the table against it as a barricade before collapsing onto the floor in tears. The whispers surrounded me now, coming from every corner of the cabin. We're so hungry. When dawn finally broke again hours later, or maybe days, time had lost all meaning. I packed up what little courage remained and fled without looking back. Even now, months later, as I sit here typing this account from safety far away from Donner Pass's cursed woods, I can still hear those whispers sometimes when night falls. Faint echoes carried by wind or woven into silence. And worse still is what lingers within me, the hunger that never truly fades, no matter how much food passes my lips. The Watcher in the Trees, by Samuel H. Carter. When my uncle passed away in the fall of 1979, I inherited his ranch out in Uinta County, Utah. It wasn't much, just a few hundred acres of scrubland, a modest house with peeling paint, and a barn that looked like it might collapse under its own weight if you sneezed too hard. But it was land, and land meant something to me. I'd spent my whole life working cattle, fixing fences, and fighting droughts. I wasn't afraid of hard work, and I wasn't afraid of stories. The stories were what people liked to talk about when they mentioned Uncle Pete's ranch. Whispers about strange lights in the sky, cattle found mutilated in ways that didn't make sense, and shadows moving through the trees at night. Superstitious nonsense, I thought. Pete had always been a little eccentric. He was the type to blame crop failures on curses rather than bad soil, but I chalked it up to small-town gossip and let it roll off my back. I moved out there in early November, just as winter was starting to settle in. The ranch was quiet, isolated. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and the only sounds were the wind cutting through the trees and the occasional lowing of cattle. It suited me fine. After all, I'd never been much for company. The first few days went smoothly enough. I patched up some fences, cleared out the junk Pete had left behind in the barn, and spent my evenings nursing a beer on the porch while watching the stars come out one by one. The sky out here was different, bigger somehow, and so clear you could see every constellation like a map laid out before you. But then came the first mutilation. I found her early one morning while I was doing my rounds, a heifer lying dead in the middle of the pasture. At first glance, I thought it might have been coyotes, or maybe even a mountain lion. But when I got closer, I realized something was wrong. Very wrong. There wasn't a drop of blood anywhere, not on her coat, not on the ground around her, and her body had been cut open with surgical precision. Her organs were gone, neatly removed as if by a scalpel rather than teeth or claws. The cuts were clean, too clean for any predator I'd ever seen. I stood there staring at her for what felt like hours before finally dragging her carcass into the barn to keep it away from scavengers. That night, as I sat on the porch trying to make sense of what had happened, I thought about Pete's stories, the ones I dismissed as nonsense, and felt a chill creep up my spine. The next few weeks brought more mutilations. 3 more cattle found dead in similar ways, and each one left me more baffled than the last. No blood, no tracks leading to or from their bodies, just those same impossible cuts that looked like they'd been made by human hands rather than anything natural. I started keeping watch at night after that, sitting out in the pasture with my rifle across my lap and a flashlight by my side. But no matter how long I stayed out there or how hard I listened for movement in the dark, nothing ever came. Until it did. It was late, past midnight, and I was sitting on an old stump near the tree line when I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the reach of my flashlight's beam. At first glance it looked human, tall and thin with arms hanging down at its sides, but as my eyes adjusted to the shadows, I realized something was wrong. Its limbs were too long, its arms stretching nearly to its knees, and its joints bent at unnatural angles that made my stomach turn. Its head tilted slightly to one side, as if studying me, but its face was hidden in shadow. I froze, gripping my rifle tightly as fear rooted me to the spot. It didn't move, not toward me or away, but its presence felt oppressive, like it was pushing against me without ever touching me. "Who's there?" I called out finally, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to sound steady. It didn't answer, not with words anyway, but after a moment it raised one hand and pointed toward the barn where I'd been keeping the mutilated cattle. Then it turned and disappeared into the trees without a sound. I didn't sleep that night, or any night after that for weeks, and every time I closed my eyes, all I could see was that figure standing there watching me with those impossible limbs and silent intent. The mutilations stopped after that encounter, or maybe they didn't. Maybe whatever had been killing them decided it didn't need to leave bodies behind anymore. But something changed on that ranch after that night. The air felt heavier somehow. The shadows seemed darker, even during daylight hours, and every time I stepped outside, I felt like something was watching me from just beyond sight. I sold the ranch 6 months later, packed up everything I owned and left Uinta County without looking back once. And though part of me regrets abandoning Pete's land after all he'd put into it, another part knows better. Some places aren't meant for people, not because they're cursed or haunted, but because they belong to something older than us, something we'll never understand no matter how hard we try. And sometimes it's better not to try at all.
Thanks for joining us in the shadows tonight. If you enjoyed these chilling tales, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more spine-tingling stories every week. Have you got a story of your own? Share it in the comments below. We love hearing from you. And remember, the darkness holds many secrets. Are you brave enough to uncover them? Until next time, keep your lights on and your doors locked. Sweet nightmares.